The scent of aged vellum and brittle ink was Alara Vance's only true companion. At 22, she moved with a quiet reverence through the small, cluttered workshop that was her self-imposed exile from the world. Her fingers, stained with traces of gold leaf and walnut ink, traced the spine of a 17th-century manuscript with a tenderness she reserved for things that could no longer feel. As a restorer of rare books and a gifted calligrapher, she breathed life back into forgotten stories, her own life held in a state of suspended animation. Each repaired page, each perfectly formed letter, was a small act of control in an existence she had never been allowed to author. She was a curator of other people's histories, a ghost haunting the margins of her own, carrying a profound and hollow stillness within her that the rustle of ancient paper could never quite fill. If you want to discover the secret behind her guarded heart and the gilded cage that confines her, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Her workshop was a world unto itself, a pocket of warm, chaotic life tucked away in the cold, cavernous shell of her ancestral home. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through a single grimy window, illuminating stacks of marbled paper, pots of pigment, and spools of silk thread. It was a fortress built of paper and ink, a sanctuary where the only judgments passed were on the quality of a binding or the consistency of a script. Here she was not merely Alara Vance, daughter of a failing dynasty, but a creator, a preserver. Every tool on her workbench, from the bone folder worn smooth by her grip to the fine-tipped quills, was an extension of a self she could only be in this room, a self that was intricate, patient, and fiercely protective of its solitude. This solitude was the guardian of her most private truth, her untouched body. Alara's virginity was not a product of religious fervor or youthful naivete. It was a shield forged in the cold fires of observation. She had grown up watching her father conduct business with the detached cruelty of a surgeon, and her mother trade smiles and secrets like currency in the city's most exclusive drawing rooms. In her world, intimacy was a transaction, a leveraging of assets, a merger of interests. Love was a negotiation. She had decided, with the quiet finality of a cloistered nun, that her body would be the last piece of her soul that could not be bartered, sold, or leveraged to settle a debt. It was the one story whose beginning and end she alone would control, even if it meant the pages remained forever blank. Outside her workshop door, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The Vance mansion was a monument to decay, a place of faded grandeur where the ghosts of wealth still lingered in the tarnished silver and the threadbare Aubusson carpets. The air was heavy with the scent of lemon polish and regret. Alara moved through its vast, empty rooms like a wraith, her soft footsteps absorbed by the thick silence. The portraits of her ancestors, their gazes stern and proprietary, followed her from the walls, their painted eyes a constant reminder of the lineage and duty that chained her to this place. The house was not a home, it was a gilded cage, its beautiful ornate bars constructed from history, expectation, and the slow, creeping rot of financial ruin. The pressure from her family was a palpable, suffocating force, a low hum of anxiety that vibrated through the floorboards. She felt it in the strained cheerfulness of her mother's voice over breakfast, a brittle sound that always preceded a discussion of a new, suitable young man. She heard it in the tense, late-night phone calls that drifted from her father's study, his words clipped and sharp with a desperation that was growing harder to conceal. They never spoke of their fears directly to her, but she was the unspoken solution to their problems, the beautifully preserved asset waiting to be liquidated. Her future was a chess piece on their board, and she felt the weight of their hands hovering over her, ready to make the sacrificial move that would save the king and queen. In her most private moments, when the silence of the great house pressed in on her, Alara felt a profound sense of unreality. It was as if she were watching her life unfold from a great distance, a character in one of the Gothic novels she so lovingly restored. She read of heroines who raged, who loved with reckless abandon, who fought for their freedom, and she felt a pang of longing so sharp it was a physical ache. Their passions, even their sorrows, felt more authentic than the carefully managed emptiness of her own days. She was living a borrowed life, a pale imitation of existence, and the void inside her was growing, threatening to consume the small, flickering flame of the person she might have been, had she ever been given the chance to choose. A change was coming. She could feel it in the shifting atmosphere of the house. It was in the new lines of strain around her father's eyes, and the way her mother's smile no longer reached hers. Tonight the feeling was stronger than ever, a subtle tightening in the air, like the stillness before a storm. The sound of a car engine, not her father's familiar sedan but something deeper, more powerful, rumbled up the long gravel driveway. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the house's stagnant peace. It was the sound of the outside world, the world of debts and consequences, arriving at her door. And as the heavy oak door creaked open downstairs, a tremor of fear, cold and sharp, ran through Ilara. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her time in the sanctuary was over. The heavy silence of the dining room was a familiar adversary. It clung to the damask tablecloth and seeped into the lukewarm soup, a thick, cloying presence that no amount of polite conversation could dispel. Ilara sat perfectly still, her spine straight, a porcelain doll arranged at the head of a table set for a feast that would never be enjoyed. Across from her, her father, Richard Vance, swirled the dregs of his wine, his gaze lost somewhere in the dark wood grain, his face a mask of weary calculation. Beside him, her mother, Beatrice, maintained a smile so bright and brittle it threatened to shatter, her eyes darting between her husband's grim profile and her daughter's placid exterior. The entire scene was a carefully staged performance of stability, a play put on for an audience of ghosts in a theater of impending collapse. Beatrice cleared her throat, the small sound echoing like a gavel in the stillness. "I spoke with Eleanor Maxwell today," she began, her voice a cascade of practiced lightness. "Her son, James, has just returned from his tour of Europe. Such a charming young man, and the Maxwells are doing wonderfully. Their shipping interests have simply exploded." She paused, her gaze resting on Ilara with pointed significance. "They're hosting a gala at the end of the month. Eleanor was so insistent we attend. It would be a perfect opportunity for you to wear that new gown, darling. A chance to circulate." The final word hung in the air, weighted with the unspoken agenda of appraisal and presentation. Ilara felt a familiar coldness seep into her limbs. She was not a daughter to be cherished, but an asset to be displayed. Richard finally looked up, his eyes clouded with a different, more urgent storm. "Circulating is the least of our concerns," he said, his voice low and frayed at the edges. "There are more significant matters at hand, matters of legacy." He chose the word carefully, as if debt were too vulgar a term to be uttered over the family silver. He looked at Ilara then, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of the stoic patriarch slipped, revealing a flicker of raw desperation. "A family like ours is built on alliances, Ilara, strong, strategic alliances. It has always been so. It is a responsibility we all must bear." The word responsibility was a cage, and she could feel its bars beginning to press in on her, cold and unyielding, constricting her breath. Later, escaping the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room, Ilara drifted through the cavernous hallways of the mansion. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold marble floors, polished to a mirror shine that reflected a distorted, elongated version of her, a ghost haunting her own home. The portraits of her ancestors stared down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with a uniform expression of stern judgment. Vances of generations past, their faces etched with the same pride and proprietary air that now sat so uneasily on her father's shoulders. She was merely the latest link in a chain of duty, her own desires and dreams irrelevant in the face of the family's preservation. The house itself felt complicit, its grand, empty rooms echoing with the silent command to conform, to sacrifice, to obey. Her mother found her in the library, a vast two-story room where thousands of books stood in silent, unread rows, their leather spines cracking with neglect. Beatrice did not raise her voice. Her words were soft, almost a caress, but they carried the sharp edge of a blade. "Your father is under a great deal of pressure," she murmured, running a manicured finger along a dusty globe. "He has dedicated his life to protecting what is ours. It is not too much to ask that you do your part." She turned, her smile a beautiful, chilling weapon. "Love is a luxury, Ilara. Security is a necessity. A good match, a powerful one, ensures our future. It ensures your future. It is a small price to pay for a life of comfort and respect." Ilara remained silent, her gaze fixed on a crack in the ceiling, feeling the chasm between her mother's world and her own widen into an impassable abyss. From the tall library window, the city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of lights against the encroaching darkness. It was a world away, a universe of anonymous freedom she could see but never touch. Each light represented a life, a choice, a story being written in real time. People were falling in love, chasing ambitions, making mistakes, living with a vibrant, messy authenticity she could only imagine. For them, the city was a promise. For her, it was a painful reminder of her own isolation, a beautiful, indifferent spectacle viewed from behind the thick, distorting glass of her gilded prison. The world of finance, of deals and leveraging, the world that was now deciding her fate, hummed with an energy she was completely severed from, its invisible currents pulling her toward a future she did not want. The pressure was becoming a physical weight, a phantom hand pressing down on her chest. In the quiet of her own mind, she saw herself as one of her books, a rare edition, beautifully bound, her contents unread, and her value determined solely by her pristine condition. The thought of being handed over to a stranger, a man chosen not for his heart but for his balance sheet, was a desecration. Her virginity, her carefully guarded inner sanctum, felt less like a shield and more like the last untouched page in a ledger book, waiting for a final, damning entry to be made. It was the only part of her that had not yet been assessed, catalogued, and prepared for sale, and the terror of that impending transaction was a slow, creeping poison. That night, a sliver of light from under her father's study door drew her closer, as did the sound of his voice, tight with a tension she had never heard before. He was on the phone, his words clipped and deferential. "I understand the terms. No, of course. It is a debt of honor, and it will be paid." There was a long pause, and Ilara held her breath, her ear pressed against the cold wood of the door. "She is a good girl, raised properly. You will find her satisfactory." Then, her father spoke a name that landed in the silence of the hallway like a stone. "I will have everything ready for your arrival, Mr. Blackwood." The name was unfamiliar, hard, and devoid of the aristocratic softness of the families her mother courted. The name echoed in her mind as she backed away from the door, a cold dread spreading through her veins. Blackwood. It sounded like a force of nature, like a shadow that consumed light. It was not the name of a suitor. It was the name of a claimant, a collector of debts. The vague threats and unspoken anxieties of the past months suddenly coalesced into this single, ominous word. The faceless man from her mother's social circles was replaced by a much more terrifying figure, a powerful, unknown entity to whom her father was surrendering. She was no longer being prepared for a marriage. She was being prepared for a payment. The walls of her cage, once merely gilded and ornate, now felt like solid iron. She fled to her workshop, the one place that had always been her sanctuary, but the familiar scent of vellum and ink offered no comfort. The air was tainted with the stench of fear. She sat at her workbench, the tools of her trade laid out before her, instruments of precision and control. But her hands trembled, her carefully constructed world shattered by a single overheard conversation. She looked at the medieval manuscript she was restoring, its illuminated page depicting a maiden trapped in a tower, guarded by a dragon. The irony was a bitter pill, a cruel joke played by fate. Her quiet, cloistered life was over. She was no longer the restorer of forgotten stories. She had just become a character in one, a virgin being offered as tribute to a monster she had never even met. He did not enter the house so much as conquer it. Damian Blackwood moved with a preternatural stillness, a man who had mastered the economy of motion, making the nervous energy of Ilara's father seem clumsy and theatrical by comparison. He was taller than she had imagined, dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the dim light of the grand foyer. It wasn't his wealth that commanded the space, but the absolute, unnerving self-possession that radiated from him. He carried the silence of his own desolate landscapes within him, and as he stepped over the threshold, he brought that cold, empty territory into their home. Ilara watched from the shadows of the upper landing, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs, as this man, this force, laid silent claim to everything her family had ever been. Summoned by her mother's hissed whisper, Ilara descended the grand staircase, each step a slow, deliberate march toward her own execution. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the worn patterns of the runner, but she could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight that was both analytical and possessive. When she finally reached the bottom and forced herself to look up, she found his eyes were not cruel, but something far more terrifying. They were empty. The color of a winter storm over a frozen sea, they held no warmth, no malice, only a profound and chilling indifference. He was looking at her the way a geologist might study a rare specimen, assessing its composition, its purity, its flaws, and its ultimate value. In that moment, she was no longer a person. She was the final, most valuable asset in a hostile takeover. The meeting took place in her father's study, a room that had always smelled of leather and quiet desperation. Now, it was Blackwood's throne room. He stood by the great mahogany desk, one hand resting lightly on its surface as if he already owned it, while her father hovered nearby, a diminished courtier in his own castle. Richard Vance, a man who had commanded boardrooms with his booming voice, was reduced to murmurs and placating gestures. Beatrice fluttered at the edges of the room, offering tea that was politely ignored, her social graces rendered useless against a man who did not trade in such currency. Damian Blackwood's presence had fundamentally altered the room's gravity. He was the sun, and her parents were merely two small, terrified planets caught in his inescapable orbit, their light extinguished by his shadow. Ilara stood by the door, refusing to be seated, refusing to be drawn fully into the transactional circle. Her defiance was a small, silent thing, a straightness of the spine, a lifting of the chin. She met his gaze directly, holding it for a fraction longer than was proper. She wanted him to see that she was not a porcelain doll to be bartered, not a frightened animal to be caged. She was a witness to this humiliation, a silent chronicler of her family's fall. In her mind, she catalogued the moment, the scent of old paper mingling with his expensive cold cologne, the way the light from the window caught the severe line of his jaw, the absolute stillness of the air thick with unspoken finality. She felt a strange, cold fire ignite within her, not passion, but a pure, unadulterated will to endure. He finally spoke, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the house. It was a voice accustomed to command, each word precise and stripped of sentiment. "The arrangements are complete," he said, his gaze never leaving Ilara's, though his words were for her father. "She will be treated with respect, as long as the terms are honored." The word respect was delivered with the same emotional detachment as arrangements and terms, another calculated variable in a complex equation. He was not making a promise of kindness, he was stating a clause in a contract. Ilara felt the invisible ink of that contract branding itself onto her skin. He was asserting his ownership, not just over her future, but over the very concept of her well-being, which was now his to define and control. From his vantage point of absolute power, Damian Blackwood had expected tears, pleas, or perhaps a display of aristocratic hysterics. He had anticipated weakness, the predictable emotional fallout of a fallen dynasty. What he found in Ilara Vance was something entirely different and profoundly unsettling. Her stillness was not the paralysis of fear, it was a form of armor. Her gaze held not terror, but a quiet, unnerving clarity, as if she were seeing straight through his wealth and his reputation to the hollow man beneath. He saw the soul of an archivist, someone who observed, recorded, and preserved. For the first time in over a decade, a variable had been introduced into his world that he could not immediately quantify. This girl, this payment, was not a liability or an asset. She was a puzzle. His mansion was a testament to his isolation, a fortress of glass and polished concrete perched on a cliff overlooking the city. Unlike her family home, which was crowded with the ghosts of the past, Blackwood's residence was aggressively, painfully present. There were no photographs, no sentimental trinkets, no clutter of a life lived. Every surface was stark, every line clean, every space vast and empty. It was less a home, and more a gallery designed to display a single priceless acquisition, power itself. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling city below like a conquered territory, its millions of twinkling lights kept at a sterile distance. As Ilara stepped into the echoing grand hall, she understood that this was not a gilded cage, but a vacuum-sealed one, designed to suffocate the messy, unpredictable nature of human connection. He led her not to a bedroom, but to the center of the vast two-story living area, and then simply left her there. The gesture was clear. She was an object to be placed on display, her presence a testament to his victory. The silence he left behind was immense, broken only by the faint hum of the building's climate control. Ilara stood motionless for a long time, a small, fragile figure in the cavernous space, feeling the cold of the Italian marble seep through the thin soles of her shoes. She was entirely alone, yet she had the distinct, chilling sensation of being watched, not by a person but by the house itself. Its cold, unblinking glass walls were his eyes, and she was the specimen under his microscope, her every breath and movement subject to his silent, remote scrutiny. Slowly, deliberately, she walked toward the immense wall of windows. The city lights glittered below, a beautiful, unattainable promise of freedom. Instead of feeling trapped, she felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she had been removed from her own life and was now observing it from a great height. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. The warmth of her hand left a faint, ephemeral print on the flawless surface, a small human mark on his sterile world. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a declaration that she was not a statue or a painting, but a living, breathing being. She was here, and she would not be erased by the sterile emptiness of his world, no matter how powerful he was or how complete his ownership of her seemed. From the mezzanine above, hidden in the architectural shadows, Damien watched her. He saw the delicate press of her hand against the glass, the faint condensation of her life force clouding his perfect view. He had expected her to explore her cage, to test its boundaries, perhaps to weep. He had not expected this silent, simple act of existence. It was not defiance in a way he understood. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the mark of a survivor. A flicker of something dangerously close to admiration sparked in the cold void of his chest, an unwelcome and unfamiliar warmth. He had acquired the Vance's most precious heirloom, but as he watched her silhouette against the city lights, a disquieting thought took root. Perhaps, in this transaction, he was the one who was truly in danger of being possessed. The days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light across the sterile marble floors. Ilara established a quiet routine, a ghost exploring the vast, empty museum of Damien Blackwood's life. She moved through the rooms with the same reverence she gave her books, observing the stark lines and cold surfaces, yet she made a point to avoid him. His presence, however, was inescapable. She felt it not as a sound or a sight, but as a subtle change in the atmospheric pressure, a tightening in the air that signaled his proximity. Her initial sharp-edged fear was slowly being eroded by something far more dangerous, a deep, unnerving curiosity. He was a puzzle box sealed with ice, and a reckless part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, wanted desperately to find the key and discover the hollow space within. She found his library on the third day. It was not a room for reading, but a vault for acquisitions. 2 stories high, lined with shelves of priceless first editions, it was a collector's monument to literature, yet it held none of the warmth of her own cluttered workshop. The air smelled of expensive leather and climate control, not the comforting dust of ages. She felt a profound kinship with the books, their spines perfectly aligned, their pages untouched, their stories held captive and unread. Running her fingers lightly over a rare, hand-bound edition of Wuthering Heights, a tale of destructive, all-consuming passion, she felt a tremor of recognition. Like them, she was a beautiful object on a shelf, her own story sealed shut, waiting for a reader who would never come. He found her there, standing in a column of afternoon light filtering through the towering windows. He didn't speak, simply leaned against the doorframe, a dark, motionless silhouette against the bright hallway. His presence was an immediate violation of the room's sterile peace, a sudden introduction of a predatory element into the quiet archive. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat, but she refused to let him see her fear. She did not flinch or turn away. Instead, she continued her slow, deliberate caress of the book's spine, her touch a delicate, almost intimate act of defiance. The air between them grew thick and heavy, charged with the unspoken tension of ownership and resistance, a silent battle waged over a single ancient story of impossible love. "Do you find value in such fantasies?" His voice, when it finally came, was startlingly close, a low baritone that seemed to absorb the room's silence. He had moved without a sound. He gestured vaguely toward the shelves, his tone laced with a weary cynicism. "They're just ink and paper, carefully constructed illusions to distract from the world's fundamental truths. Acquisition and loss." Elara turned to face him, the heavy book a fragile shield clutched to her chest. "They're more than that," she replied, her voice barely a whisper but clear in the stillness. "They preserve what is most human. A place to keep a soul when the world tries to take it." Her words were not an argument, but a quiet statement of faith, a defense of the very thing he seemed to have long since discarded. Her answer seemed to find a crack in his impenetrable armor. For a fleeting, unguarded second, the coldness in his storm-gray eyes was replaced by a flicker of something ancient and deeply wounded, a profound longing that he had buried under layers of wealth and power. It was the look of a man staring through a window at a warmth he could never feel, a ghost remembering what it was to be alive. The moment was gone as quickly as it had appeared, the mask of detached indifference slamming back into place, but Elara had seen it. It was a revelation that shifted the very ground beneath her feet. The monster in this story was haunted, and his ghosts were far more terrifying than his anger. He wasn't just a captor, he was a fellow prisoner. She moved to place the book back on its shelf, her body tense with a strange, new awareness of him. He stepped forward at the same moment, his intention unclear, their paths intersecting in the narrow space between the shelves. As she reached up, the back of her hand brushed against his. The contact was brief, accidental, a whisper of skin against skin, but it sent a bolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her. It was a shock of warmth in the vast, cold expanse of the house, a jolt of terrifying life that arced between them. In that single, fleeting moment, he was not a concept or a captor. He was flesh and blood, a man whose touch felt like a brand, searing a permanent mark onto the untouched landscape of her skin. He recoiled as if he had been burned, his entire body going rigid. A muscle in his jaw tightened, and he took a sharp, involuntary breath. The mask of cold indifference was back, but it was now a flawed facade, cracked by the undeniable evidence of his own reaction. He was not immune to her. The knowledge was a dangerous and intoxicating thing, a sudden shift in the balance of power. It was a weapon she had no idea how to wield and was terrified to possess. He had taken her freedom, her home, her future, but in that one accidental touch, she had discovered a vulnerability he guarded more fiercely than his fortune. He turned and left the library without another word, leaving her trembling in a silence that was now filled with his presence. Elara fled to the cold sanctuary of her assigned room, her hand still tingling, the phantom heat of his touch a ghost on her skin. That single, brief contact had awakened something dormant and dangerous within her, a primal current of awareness that she had spent her entire life suppressing. The desire she had always equated with transaction, with loss of self, now had a new, terrifying texture. It was personal, specific, and aimed at the one man she should despise above all others. Her carefully constructed shield of virginity, once a symbol of her control, now felt like a fragile, brittle thing, threatening to shatter. The walls of her inner sanctum had been breached, not by force, but by a single, accidental spark that threatened to ignite a wildfire. Their shared meals became the new arena for their silent war. They sat at opposite ends of a long, polished dining table, the vast expanse of dark wood between them a chasm filled with unspoken tension. The silence was no longer empty. It was a living entity, charged with the memory of that touch in the library and the weight of their philosophical divide. Every clink of silverware against porcelain, every sip of water, was a sound amplified in the charged stillness, an exclamation point in a conversation they were not having. Elara focused on the simple mechanics of eating, forcing herself to remain composed, feeling his gaze on her like a physical touch, a constant, unnerving pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He watched her with an unnerving intensity, his gaze analytical and dissecting, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. He seemed to be searching for the flaw in her composure, the crack in her quiet defiance. In return, she forced herself to meet his eyes across the long table, holding his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, refusing to be the first to look away. These silent duels were exhausting, yet in them, she felt more seen and more real than she ever had under her mother's appraising glances or her father's dismissive ones. He might see her as an asset, but he was at least studying its properties, and in his unrelenting focus, she felt a strange, terrifying flicker of being truly alive. One evening, the house's automated system began to play a piece of classical music, a sorrowful and complex piano sonata that filled the cavernous dining hall. Elara saw Damien's hand clench around the stem of his wineglass, his knuckles turning white. A shadow of profound, visceral pain passed over his face, so raw and unguarded it was like seeing a wound suddenly torn open. He rose abruptly from his chair and strode to a wall panel, silencing the music with a single, violent stab of his finger. The sudden quiet was more deafening than the melody had been, a void where a ghost had just been screaming. She understood then that his sterile fortress was not just designed to keep the world out, but to keep his own memories locked in their cells. An unwelcome and dangerous pang of empathy resonated deep within her chest. This man was not merely a monster who collected beautiful broken things. He was a prisoner, haunted by ghosts she couldn't see. He was trapped in this vast, empty house with her, but his cage was infinitely more cruel because it was one of his own making, forged from a past so painful he had to silence music to survive it. The stark, simple line between captor and captive began to blur, twisting into something far more complicated and treacherous. To desire a monster was a form of madness, but to feel a pull toward a deeply wounded man, to want to understand the source of his pain, was a different kind of danger entirely. A danger to her heart. That night, she dreamt not of Damien but of her old life. She was at a lavish gala, the air thick with perfume and false laughter. Her mother's hand was a cold weight on her back, pushing her forward, presenting her to a line of faceless, smiling young men whose eyes appraised her like livestock at an auction. The sense of suffocating helplessness, of being a pristine product for sale, was so real that she woke up gasping for air, her nightgown damp with a cold sweat. In the sterile silence of Damien's mansion, she had a startling realization. The gilded cage of her past, with its soft-spoken rules and familial obligations, suddenly seemed infinitely more terrifying and restrictive than the stark, honest prison of her present. Unable to fall back asleep, she wandered downstairs, the cool marble a shock to her bare feet. She found him in the main living area, standing before the immense wall of windows, a solitary silhouette against the glittering tapestry of the city. A glass of amber liquid was in his hand, and he stared out at the world below him, as if it were a kingdom he had conquered but could never inhabit. He seemed utterly, profoundly alone, a king ruling over an empire of ghosts. He was so lost in his own private hell that he was completely unaware of her presence, giving her a rare, unfiltered glimpse of the man stripped bare of his power, his wealth, and his rage, a man hollowed out by his own victories. A strange, reckless courage, born from the lingering terror of her nightmare, compelled her to stay. She did not retreat into the shadows. Instead, she spoke his name into the darkness, her voice soft but clear. Damien. It was the first time she had ever used it, and the sound of it in the vast, silent room felt both intimate and forbidden. The single word hung in the air between them, a fragile, tentative bridge across the chasm of their circumstance. He turned slowly, his face unreadable in the dim light, but she felt the atmosphere shift, the air crackling as if a storm had just changed direction. She had broken a rule, stepped over an invisible line, and they both knew there was no going back. He didn't answer the unspoken question of why he was awake. Instead, he just looked at her, his gaze stripping away all pretense, and a raw, bitter honesty escaped him, the words torn from a place he kept locked away. "You should not be here," he said, his voice rough with something other than anger. "This place, I built it to keep things pure, uncontaminated." He was speaking of his solitude, his sterile, controlled world. But Elara heard the devastating subtext with perfect clarity. In his eyes, she was the pure, uncontaminated thing. He was the poison he was terrified of spreading, the corruption he had built these glass walls to contain, It was the most selfless thing she had ever heard him say. His words were meant as a warning, a command to keep her distance, but she heard them as a desperate confession. He was pushing her away not out of cruelty, but in a twisted, painful attempt to protect her from himself. Her entire moral compass began to spin. The choice was no longer a simple one between captivity and freedom. What if true freedom meant returning to a life that was its own form of slow death? The desire she felt for him was no longer just a terrifying physical pull. It was an emotional gravitation toward the broken man behind the monstrous facade. To surrender to that desire might mean losing the last piece of herself she had fought so hard to control, but for the first time, Ilara wondered if that very surrender might be the only true act of liberation she had ever known. The tense, silent ritual of their dinner was shattered by the shrill electronic summons of a phone. It was not Damien's personal device, but a dedicated line from a console on the sideboard, a stark piece of technology that hummed with a latent menace. He rose with a predatory grace and answered, turning his back to her, his body immediately coiling into a posture of rigid aggression. Ilara could only hear his side of the conversation, a series of clipped, guttural monosyllables. But she saw the change in him. The cold, controlled financier dissolved, replaced by something primal and lethal. His knuckles were white where he gripped the console, and a muscle feathered violently in his jaw. The name he finally spoke was not a name at all, but a curse spat into the receiver, a word so full of history and venom that it seemed to poison the air in the room. He ended the call by slamming the phone down with a controlled violence that was more terrifying than any shout. The silence that descended was absolute, a vacuum where the sound had been. He did not turn to face her. He stood frozen, his back a rigid wall of black tailored wool, radiating a fury so palpable it felt like a physical heat. Then, with a sudden, explosive movement, he swept a crystal decanter from the sideboard, sending it crashing into the marble fireplace. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the cavernous room, a visceral expression of the chaos he kept so tightly contained. This was not the anger of a frustrated businessman. It was the rage of a king whose borders had been breached, whose most prized possession had been threatened. And Ilara knew, with a chilling certainty that went bone deep, that the possession was her. In the face of this raw, untamed violence, Ilara did not feel the terror she should have. Instead, a strange and profound calm settled over her, a clarity that cut through the years of fear and repression. She saw him not as a monster to be feared, but as a fortress under siege, and she was the treasure within its walls that he was desperate to protect. The threat from the outside world, a threat aimed at her family to wound him, had perversely become the final, unbreakable link in the chain that bound them. His rage was a shield, his violence a testament to a protective instinct she had never known. The carefully constructed logic of her world, where quiet was safety and passion was a transaction, was irrevocably shattered. She saw his pain, his fury, and his fear for her, and she felt not a captive, but a cause. She rose from her chair, her own movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to his explosive energy. The sound of her chair, scraping softly against the floor, drew his attention. He finally turned, and the look in his eyes was that of a cornered wolf, blazing with a dangerous, untamed fire. "Go to your room, Ilara," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly growl that vibrated with suppressed violence. It was not a request. It was a desperate order from a man trying to shield the last pure thing in his life from the filth of his world. But she had spent her entire life obeying commands, retreating to the safety of her designated spaces. For the first time, she chose to transgress. She took a step toward him, toward the heart of the storm. "No," she said, her voice a quiet anchor in the raging sea of his fury. Hours passed in a state of suspended animation. The broken glass was cleared away by an unseen hand, but the tension remained, a thick, suffocating blanket over the house. Ilara waited in her room, the silence a drumbeat against her ears, every nerve ending alive with a terrifying, exhilarating anticipation. Just after midnight, a soft, hesitant knock came at her door. When she opened it, Damien stood on the threshold, a ghost of the man who had shattered the crystal decanter. The fire in his eyes had died down, leaving behind desolate gray embers of exhaustion, and a vulnerability so profound it stole her breath. He looked stripped bare, the armor of his wealth and power gone, leaving only the deeply wounded man beneath, a man who looked as though he were on the verge of collapsing under the weight of his own past. "He knows about you," Damien said, his voice raw and hollowed out. "He will use your family. He will use you. It's true. It's how this game is played. They find the one part of a man's life that isn't already corrupt, the one thing that still has light, and they do everything they can to extinguish it." He finally looked at her, and his gaze was filled with a desperate, agonizing self-loathing. "I brought you into this darkness, Ilara. I brought you here as an object, a final piece in my revenge. But I was wrong. You are not an object. You are a reckoning." He took a ragged breath, the confession torn from him. "And I cannot bear the thought of my world tainting you. You must leave. You must go back to your books and your quiet life before I destroy you completely." His words were a plea for her to save herself, but all Ilara heard was the depth of his own despair. He was trying to protect her from himself. He saw her as pure, as light, and he believed himself to be an irredeemable poison. In that moment of raw, painful honesty, the last of her reservations turned to dust. This was not a captor and a victim. This was two prisoners, trapped in different cages, reaching for each other through the bars. With a courage she never knew she possessed, she closed the small distance between them. She raised a trembling hand and laid it flat against the hard wall of his chest. Through the fine fabric of his shirt, she could feel the frantic, heavy thrum of his heart. "What if I'm not afraid of the dark?" she whispered, her voice a fragile vow in the immense silence. That was the touch that broke him. A choked, guttural sound tore from his throat, the sound of a man who had been starved of gentle human contact for an eternity. His control, his discipline, his entire, carefully constructed world shattered in that instant. His hands came up to frame her face, his grip desperate yet infinitely tender, as if he were holding something impossibly precious and fragile. He crashed his mouth down on hers, and it was not a kiss of seduction, but of utter desperation. It was a raw, bruising collision of his lifetime of loneliness and her lifetime of longing. It tasted of expensive whiskey and profound sorrow, a frantic, hungry claiming that was both a surrender and a plea. In his kiss, she felt the full devastating weight of his solitude, and she met it with the entirety of her own. When the kiss finally broke, they were both breathless, foreheads pressed together, the world outside the doorway ceasing to exist. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones with a reverence that made her entire body tremble. She kept her palm pressed to his chest, anchoring herself to the wild, galloping rhythm of his heart. She looked into his eyes and saw the storm was still there, but now it was a storm of raw, unguarded emotion, desire, fear, and a fragile, terrifying glimmer of hope. He had spent his life building impenetrable walls to keep the world out, but with one quiet act of defiance, one simple touch, she had walked straight through them. He had let her into the most broken, desolate part of himself, and the intimacy of that silent welcome was more profound than any physical act could ever be. Without a word, he bent and swept her into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. The motion was possessive, yet exquisitely gentle. He carried her over the threshold of her room, his gaze locked on hers, and kicked the door shut behind them, sealing them away from the cold, sterile mansion and the violent world it represented. This was the true point of no return. This was not the claiming of a debt. It was the desperate act of a man bringing his only vulnerability to the only sanctuary he had ever known. As he laid her down on the soft expanse of the bed, the moonlight from the window tracing the hard lines of his face, Ilara knew the girl who restored old books was gone forever. She was no longer a curator of past stories. She was about to become the author of a new, dangerous, and magnificent one. The first light of dawn was a cruel, clinical thing, slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows and spilling across the empty half of the bed. Ilara woke to a silence so profound it felt like a scream. The space beside her was cold, the pristine white sheet smooth and undisturbed, bearing no imprint of the man who had carried her there. The raw, desperate intimacy of the night, the collision of his pain and her longing, now felt like a fever dream that had broken, leaving behind a chilling, hollow ache. The room, which hours before had been a sanctuary, now felt vast and sterile, the air thick with the ghost of a shared breath. She curled into herself, the phantom sensation of his hands on her face, his lips on hers, a tormenting echo in the unforgiving solitude. She had unlocked the last door to her soul, and he had simply walked away, leaving it wide open to the cold morning air. In his office, a sterile altar to commerce and control, Damien stood before the vast window, the rising sun casting his silhouette in sharp, unforgiving lines. The city below was a kingdom he had conquered, yet he felt like a trespasser in his own skin. Her touch, her scent, her quiet, earth-shattering question, "What if I'm not afraid of the dark?" was a virus in his system, dismantling the code he had lived by for 2 decades. Every self-preservation instinct, honed by betrayal and loss, screamed at him to contain the threat. And she was the threat. She was the light that illuminated the rot in his soul, the warmth that made him feel the true, agonizing depth of his own coldness. To protect her was to excise her from his life, a brutal act of self-mutilation. He would be the monster. He would be the villain in her story. It was the only act of love he was capable of, a final, cruel kindness to save her from himself. When she finally emerged from her room, she found him in the dining hall, a figure carved from shadow and ice. He stood beside the long, dark table, a tablet in his hand, his focus absolute, his presence an impenetrable wall of cold indifference. He did not acknowledge her entrance. The deliberate dismissal was a physical blow, a negation of every shared secret from the night before. The air, once electric with unspoken desire, was now a vacuum, suffocating her with its emptiness. She opened her mouth to speak, to form a question, to find the man who had held her with such desperate tenderness, but the words died in her throat. His silence was a meticulously crafted weapon, designed to sever, to cauterize, to deny. He was erasing them as she was forced to stand and watch, a ghost at the scene of her own emotional execution. He finally spoke, his voice the flat, detached baritone of a stranger finalizing a transaction. "A car will be here in an hour. Your father's affairs have been resolved. The terms of our arrangement are concluded." He delivered the words without looking at her, his gaze locked on the glowing screen as if she were a minor interruption. This was it. The freedom she should have craved, the release she should have celebrated. Yet it was delivered as a final, brutal rejection, a banishment from his world. He was not setting her free. He was discarding her, reducing the raw, earth-shattering connection they had shared to a line item on a ledger that was now closed. The doors of the gilded cage were swinging open, but Alara felt as though she was being shoved out into a barren wilderness, more lost and alone than she had ever been inside. The silent drive back to the Vance mansion was a journey through a gray, muted world that matched the landscape of her heart. A profound sense of loss, warred with a sharp, sickening shame. She had transgressed her own most sacred law, surrendered the one piece of herself she had vowed to protect. And for what? For a glimpse of a wounded soul who had now slammed the door in her face. His desperation, his confession, his raw vulnerability, had it all been a lie? Or worse, had it been a moment of weakness he now regretted so deeply that he had to eradicate her from his life to regain his balance? The memory of her own boldness, of reaching for him, now felt like a foolish, naive mistake. She felt used, not by his power, but by her own hope. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in her stomach, heavy with the knowledge that she had given everything and been left with less than nothing. Her homecoming was not a comfort, but an immersion in a different kind of cold. Beatrice met her with a look of thinly veiled disappointment, her daughter's return signaling the failure of a lucrative social merger. Richard, her father, could not meet her eyes, his own shame at having bartered her now compounded by the humiliation of accepting a handout from the man who had rejected her. They asked no questions about her time away, offered no words of comfort. Her emotional state was irrelevant. Her value had been in the transaction, and now that the deal was void, she was once again just a fixture in the decaying house. She had escaped the sterile prison of glass and steel only to be returned to the familiar cage of familial neglect, where the bars were woven from disappointment and unspoken resentments. Here she was not a person, but a failed asset. Back in his fortress of solitude, Damien was drowning in the silence. Ilara's absence was not an emptiness, but a dense, suffocating presence. It was in the faint scent of old books and jasmine that still clung to the air in the library. It was in the echo of her quiet voice in the cavernous halls. The house, once his perfectly controlled sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum for a life he had just murdered. He had done the necessary thing, the only thing a man like him, a man defined by his own darkness, could do. He had saved her. But the victory tasted like ash. It was a hollow, pyrrhic triumph that left an ache in his chest so deep it felt like a structural flaw in his own soul. He had spent his life amputating every human connection to save himself from pain, and in cutting her away, he had performed the most savage surgery on himself. The days that followed were a long, gray blur. Ilara retreated to her workshop, the one place that had always been her refuge, but its magic was gone. The scent of vellum and ink was no longer a comfort, but a reminder of the naive girl she had been. Grief and shame were a paralyzing weight, pinning her to the past. Yet, slowly, beneath the layers of heartbreak, something new began to stir. The woman who had returned from Damien's mansion was not the same one who had been delivered there. She had faced a monster and found a man. She had touched a power, both his and her own, that she never knew existed. The quiet, compliant girl had been forged in a fire, and the brittle porcelain had been replaced by a core of tempered steel. The memory of her own courage, of reaching for him in his darkest moment, began to transform from a source of shame into a wellspring of a new and formidable strength. One afternoon, in a quiet act of rebellion against her own despair, she took a perfect, unused sheet of calfskin vellum. She prepared a pot of rich, iron gall ink, the color of a midnight storm. Instead of meticulously copying the words of a long-dead poet, she dipped her quill and began to write. It was not the precise, controlled script of a restorer. It was a bold, fierce, and deeply emotional hand. She did not write a story or a verse, she wrote her own name. Ilara. Over and over, the strokes filling the page, each one a reclamation, a declaration of self. She was not a footnote in her family's history, not a clause in a broken contract. She was the author. This was the first page of her own story, and even if it began with heartbreak, she would be the one to write the ending. Miles away, in his glass tower overlooking the city, Damien sat in the darkness, staring at a screen. He had pulled up the archive security footage from the library, from the day it had all changed. He watched the small, silent figure of Ilara, her hands moving over the ancient books with a lover's reverence. He zoomed in, his finger tracing her image on the screen, pausing on the exact moment their hands had brushed, a fleeting, accidental spark that had ignited a wildfire in the barren landscape of his life. He could not bring himself to delete the file. He had sent her away to save her, to preserve her light from the encroaching darkness of his world. But he now faced a devastating, absolute truth. Her light had not been in danger of being extinguished by him. It had been the only thing keeping his own darkness at bay. And without it, he was lost in an endless, echoing night. Months passed, each one a page turned in a new volume of Ilara's life. She had not returned to the Vance mansion, but had instead used a small, forgotten inheritance from her grandmother to lease a small studio in the city's historic artisan quarter. Her workshop was no longer a refuge from the world, but an open door to it. Commissions came flooding in from universities and private collectors who had heard of the quiet prodigy who could breathe life back into the most hopeless of paper ruins. The hollow stillness within her had been filled, not with love, but with purpose. She was no longer a curator of other people's stories. She was actively, painstakingly, and sometimes painfully writing her own, the ink of her newfound independence staining her fingers in a way that felt like a permanent and triumphant declaration of self. One rain-slicked afternoon, when the gray light softened the hard edges of the city, a shadow fell across her threshold. It was a silhouette she would have recognized in any light, in any lifetime. Damien Blackwood stood in the doorway of her small workshop, a figure of stark, severe modernity amidst the controlled chaos of her ancient craft. He was dressed in his uniform of expensive, dark wool, but the fabric seemed to hang on a frame that had lost some of its formidable rigidity. He looked profoundly out of place, and for the first time, she saw not a conqueror, but a man seeking asylum, his eyes, the color of a winter storm, holding a deep, desolate exhaustion that he no longer bothered to conceal. He had stepped out of his world and was hesitating on the edge of hers. He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze a slow, deliberate caress over every detail of her new life, the pots of pigment, the neatly arranged tools, the half-finished manuscript on her workbench. His eyes finally came to rest on her, and in them she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before, a profound and humbling awe. He was not looking at the girl he had taken as payment, the pristine object he had locked away in his glass tower. He was seeing the woman she had forged from the ashes of that transaction, a woman who had built a new world for herself with her own two hands. The suffocating silence that had once defined them was gone, replaced by a quiet filled with the weight of their shared history and the vast, aching expanse of all that had been left unsaid. He carried a flat wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl, which he placed gently on a clear space on her workbench. He opened it with a careful, almost reverent touch. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a book. It was a 16th-century illuminated manuscript, its leather binding split, its pages warped and stained by what looked like fire and water. It was a beautiful, tragic ruin. "I was told it was unsalvageable," he said, his voice a low, rough thing, stripped of all its former authority, "that its story was lost, destroyed by a fire a long time ago." He finally met her gaze, and the raw, desperate plea in his eyes was a confession more intimate than their kiss. He was not talking about the book. He was offering her the wreckage of his own past. Alara felt the world tilt on its axis, the past and present collapsing into a single, breathtaking moment. He had come to her not with an apology, which would have been meaningless, but with a symbolic offering of his most broken self. He was asking her not for forgiveness, but for her particular magic, the ability to see value in what others had discarded, to find the story hidden within the damage. She reached out, her fingers, stained with ink and gold leaf, hovering just above the brittle, water-damaged page. She felt the full weight of her own power, a quiet, steady force that had nothing to do with wealth or control. "Nothing is ever truly lost," she whispered, her voice a balm in the quiet room. "Sometimes a story just needs a safer place to be told." His composure finally, irrevocably broke. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow, solitary path through the stoic landscape of his face. It was not a sign of weakness, but a profound act of surrender, a lifetime of guarded pain released in one silent, glistening drop. He had brought his darkness into her light, not to extinguish it, but to ask if it could be mended. Alara did not move to comfort him. She simply held his gaze, her quiet strength, a lighthouse in his storm. The gilded cage was a distant memory. Its bars melted away, leaving only this: two souls, one a restorer and one a ruin, standing on the precipice of a new, unwritten chapter. If you believe some stories are worth the patience it takes to heal them, I invite you to subscribe, like, share, and comment on what you think their future holds.